The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Rose Patterson's small apartment above the bakery, casting gentle shadows across the worn wooden floor. At 68, she had grown accustomed to the solitude, the quiet rhythm of her days marked only by the soft chiming of the grandfather clock her late husband had left her. But today felt different. Today the silence seemed heavier, weighted with the knowledge that somewhere across town, her daughter Sarah was struggling in ways Rose could barely comprehend. 3 years had passed since Sarah's world had crumbled. The divorce from Michael had been bitter, leaving her with two young children and a mountain of debt. But it wasn't the financial hardship that had driven the wedge between mother and daughter. It was the pills. What had started as prescribed medication for chronic back pain had slowly transformed into something darker, more consuming. Rose had watched helplessly as her once vibrant daughter, a successful real estate agent with a bright smile and boundless energy, had become a stranger who avoided eye contact and made excuses for missed family dinners. The worst part was how it had affected the grandchildren. 10-year-old Emma had become unnaturally quiet, her once sparkling eyes now cautious and worried. 7-year-old Jake had started acting out at school, his teacher calling Rose instead of Sarah when problems arose. The children had been staying with Rose more and more frequently, their overnight bags packed with the careful precision of souls who had learned not to expect stability. Rose's own childhood had been far from perfect. Growing up during the Depression with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, she had learned early that love sometimes came wrapped in harsh lessons. Her father, Thomas, had been a proud man brought low by circumstances beyond his control. The factory job that had sustained their family for 15 years had disappeared overnight, leaving him adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for his particular skills. The bottle had become his refuge, and Rose's childhood had been marked by the sound of her father's heavy footsteps on the stairs, never knowing if he would be kind or cruel. But there had been moments, precious, shining moments, when the clouds would part. She remembered one Christmas Eve when money was especially tight. Her father had disappeared for most of the day, and Rose had assumed he was at Murphy's Tavern, drinking away what little they had left. Instead, he had returned home just as the sun was setting, his cheeks red from the cold, carrying a small potted evergreen tree he had somehow managed to acquire. Together they had decorated it with paper angels Rose had made at school, and strings of popcorn her mother had helped her thread. It wasn't much, but in that moment, their tiny apartment had felt like the most magical place on earth. Her father had died when Rose was just 16, his liver finally succumbing to years of abuse. At his funeral, Rose had expected to feel anger, resentment for all the ways he had failed them. Instead, she had felt an overwhelming sadness for a man who had never learned how to carry his pain without drowning in it. Her mother, Margaret, had never remarried, dedicating her life to raising Rose and her younger brother, William, with a fierce determination that brooked no nonsense. "You make your own happiness in this world," Margaret used to say, her hands never still as she mended clothes or prepared meals with whatever ingredients they could afford. "Nobody else is going to do it for you." It was a philosophy that had served Rose well through her own marriage to Henry, a gentle man who had run the neighborhood bakery with the same steady reliability he brought to their 42-year marriage. They had been blessed with 2 children, David, who had followed in his father's footsteps and now ran bakeries in 3 different states, and Sarah, who had been their miracle baby, born when Rose was 41 and had long given up hope of having another child. David had always been the responsible one, the child who colored within the lines and never caused a moment's worry. Even now at 45, he called every Sunday without fail, his voice warm with genuine affection as he shared stories of his own children's achievements. His wife, Linda, was a kindergarten teacher with an endless supply of patience and homemade cookies. Their 3 children were polite, well-adjusted, and everything grandparents could hope for. Sarah had been different from the beginning. Where David was cautious, Sarah was bold. Where David sought approval, Sarah blazed her own trail. She had been the child who brought home stray animals, who stood up to bullies twice her size, who could light up a room simply by walking into it. Rose had often wondered if she had loved Sarah too much, if her fierce protection of her unexpected blessing had somehow failed to prepare her daughter for the harsh realities of adult life. The phone call that changed everything had come on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah's voice had been slurred, her words tumbling together in a way that made Rose's heart clench with recognition. She had heard that same tone in her father's voice too many times to mistake it for anything else. "Mom, I need help," Sarah had whispered, and Rose could hear the children crying in the background. "I can't, I don't know how to stop." Rose had driven across town in her old Honda, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She had found Sarah curled up on the bathroom floor, an empty prescription bottle beside her, while Emma tried to comfort a sobbing Jake in the living room. The house that had once been Sarah's pride and joy, a charming Victorian she had restored with her own hands, was now a monument to neglect. Dishes overflowed from the sink, laundry lay in neglected piles, and the air held the stale scent of a life slowly unraveling. That night, Rose had taken the children home with her, their few belongings hastily packed in grocery bags. Sarah had been admitted to the hospital, her system dangerously flooded with medications she had been taking in increasingly desperate attempts to quiet the pain that had consumed her life. The back injury that had started it all had healed months ago, but by then, Sarah's body had developed a dependency that went far beyond physical pain. The intervention had been David's idea. He had flown in from Denver with Linda, their faces grave with concern and determination. They had gathered in Rose's small living room, Rose, David, Linda, and Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's, where Sarah had been baptized 37 years earlier. Sarah had sat in the corner chair, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield, her eyes darting between their faces with the wariness of a cornered animal. "We love you," Rose had said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain strong. "But we can't watch you destroy yourself anymore." Sarah had raged, pleaded, made promises they all knew she couldn't keep. But underneath the desperation, Rose had seen something else. Relief. Relief that someone was finally taking the burden of choice away from her, that she no longer had to pretend she was in control of something that had long since spiraled beyond her grasp. The treatment center was in the mountains, a place called Serenity Ridge that specialized in helping people reclaim their lives from addiction. It wasn't the most expensive facility available, but it had something more valuable than luxury amenities. It had hope. Rose had driven Sarah there on a crisp April morning, the silence between them heavy with all the words they couldn't seem to find. "I'm scared, Mom," Sarah had whispered as they pulled into the parking lot, her voice small and young in a way that reminded Rose of the little girl who used to crawl into bed during thunderstorms. "I know, sweetheart," Rose had replied, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand. "But sometimes being scared is the first step toward being brave." The next 6 months had been the longest of Rose's life. She had become a full-time grandmother, learning to navigate the complexities of homework, help, and soccer practice schedules. Emma had gradually begun to smile again, her natural resilience slowly reasserting itself with the stability of routine and unconditional love. Jake had been more challenging, his anger manifesting in tantrums and defiant behavior that tested Rose's patience in ways she hadn't experienced since her own children were small. But there had been beautiful moments too. Evening walks to the park where Jake would collect interesting stones and Emma would point out cloud formations. Saturday mornings spent baking cookies together, the kitchen filled with laughter and the sweet smell of vanilla. Bedtime stories that stretched longer than they should have, because Rose couldn't bear to see the worry return to their eyes when the lights went out. The calls from Sarah were initially brief and stilted, supervised conversations that felt more like performance than genuine connection. But gradually, as the weeks passed, Rose began to hear something new in her daughter's voice: clarity. The fog of medication was lifting, and the woman Rose remembered was slowly emerging from the shadows. "I'm learning about myself," Sarah had said during one of their weekly calls, "about why I needed the pills so badly, why I couldn't just stop." Her voice had grown thoughtful, more reflective than Rose had heard in years. "It wasn't really about the pain, Mom. It was about feeling like I was drowning, and the pills were the only thing that helped me float." Rose had understood more than Sarah knew. She remembered her own father's face on the nights when the weight of his failures became too much to bear without the numbing embrace of alcohol. She remembered the way he would look at her sometimes with such profound sadness, as if he could see all the ways he was failing her, but couldn't find the strength to change course. When Sarah completed the program, Rose had driven back to Serenity Ridge to bring her home. But the woman who walked out of the treatment center was different from the one who had walked in. She was thinner, her face more angular, but her eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been in years. She moved with purpose instead of the careful deliberation of someone trying to hide their impairment. "I want to see them," Sarah had said as they drove through the mountain passes toward home. "The kids, but I'm scared that they'll be afraid of me." "They love you," Rose had assured her. "Love doesn't disappear, even when we can't always see it clearly." The reunion had been tentative at first. Emma had hung back, studying her mother with the analytical gaze of a child who had learned to read adult moods for survival. Jake had been more direct, launching himself into Sarah's arms with the uncomplicated affection of a 7-year-old who had missed his mother desperately. The tears that had followed had been healing ones, washing away months of accumulated fear and uncertainty. But rebuilding trust was a slower process than anyone had anticipated. Sarah had moved into a small apartment across town, determined to prove her stability before asking for more time with her children. She had found work at a local nonprofit that helped other families navigate the challenges of addiction and recovery. The pay was modest, but the work gave her purpose in a way her previous career never had. The children continued to live with Rose, though they spent increasing amounts of time with their mother as the months passed. Sarah attended every school event, every soccer game, every piano recital. She was building a new relationship with her children, one founded on honesty rather than the careful facades she had maintained during her illness. It was during one of these visits that Sarah had made an unexpected discovery. While helping Emma with a school project about family history, she had asked Rose to show them some old photographs. In the bottom of the box, beneath faded wedding pictures and baby photos, Sarah had found something she had never seen before. A letter her grandfather Thomas had written to Rose before his death. The letter was brief, written in the shaky handwriting of a man whose hands were no longer steady, but the words were clear. "My dear Rose, I know I failed you in more ways than I can count. I pray that you will remember not just the worst of me, but also the moments when I tried to be the father you deserved. The tree we decorated that Christmas still grows in my heart, even in my darkest hours. I hope someday you can forgive an old man who loved his family but never learned how to show it properly." Sarah had read the letter twice, her eyes filling with tears. "I never knew he wrote this. I found it in his pocket after he died," Rose had said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should share it. He was a complicated man, your grandfather. He loved us, but he didn't know how to love himself enough to stop hurting." That night, Sarah had stayed for dinner, and as they sat around Rose's small kitchen table, she had shared stories of her recovery that she had never told before. She spoke of the other women she had met in treatment, mothers like herself who had lost their way, but were finding their path back to their families. She talked about the counseling sessions where she had learned to recognize the triggers that had led to her dependence and the strategies she was still learning to manage them. "I used to think that being strong meant never asking for help," Sarah had said, her voice steady but emotional. "But I've learned that real strength is knowing when you need support and being brave enough to reach for it." The turning point came almost a year after Sarah's return from treatment. Emma had been invited to a sleepover at a friend's house, and Jake had begged to spend the night with his mother. Sarah had called Rose that evening, her voice thick with an emotion Rose couldn't quite identify. "He had a nightmare," Sarah had said, "about me leaving again. And when I went to comfort him, he asked me if I was going to disappear like his dad did." Sarah's voice had broken then. "I realized that I had disappeared, Mom. Maybe not physically, but I hadn't really been present for so long that he was afraid to trust that I would stay." They had talked for hours that night, mother and daughter finally able to bridge the gap that addiction had created between them. Sarah had apologized not just for the practical consequences of her illness, the missed school events, the frightened children, the burden placed on Rose, but for the deeper wounds caused by her absence from her own life. "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you raised me to be," Sarah had whispered. "You are exactly who I raised you to be," Rose had replied firmly. "You're strong enough to fight for what matters. You're brave enough to face hard truths. You're compassionate enough to help others who are struggling. These are the qualities I saw in you as a child, and they're the qualities that brought you back to us. The second Christmas after Sarah's recovery had been magical in ways that reminded Rose of that long-ago Christmas Eve with her father and the little potted tree. Sarah had moved back into her Victorian house, which she had slowly been restoring to its former beauty. The children were spending equal time between both homes now, secure in the knowledge that they had two places where they were unconditionally loved. They had gathered in Sarah's living room, the tree twinkling with lights that reflected off the freshly polished hardwood floors. David and his family had flown in from Denver, and for the first time in years, the entire family was together. As they exchanged gifts and shared stories, Rose had felt a profound sense of gratitude for the long, difficult journey that had brought them to this moment. Emma had grown into a thoughtful 12-year-old who wrote poetry and spoke with wisdom beyond her years about the importance of family. Jake, now 9, had channeled his energy into baseball and art, his natural exuberance no longer shadowed by anxiety about adult reliability. Sarah had been clean for 18 months, and the transformation was visible not just in her appearance, but in her presence. She was fully engaged, completely present in a way she hadn't been for years. But it was the conversation between Sarah and David that had touched Rose most deeply. Her son had pulled his sister aside after dinner, and Rose had overheard him say, "I'm proud of you. I know it wasn't easy, but you fought your way back to us. That takes more courage than I think I could have managed." As the evening wound down and the family began to say their goodbyes, Sarah had found a quiet moment with Rose in the kitchen. They stood side by side, washing dishes and putting away leftovers, comfortable in the familiar rhythm of shared domestic tasks. "I found something in Dad's old toolbox," Sarah had said suddenly. "Something I wanted to show you." She had pulled out a small wooden box, carefully carved with roses and painted in delicate pastels. Rose had recognized it immediately. It was a jewelry box Henry had made for Sarah's 16th birthday, but which had been lost in the chaos of Sarah's illness and subsequent moves. "I thought it was gone forever," Rose had breathed, touching the smooth wood with gentle fingers. "It was in the garage, buried under some old furniture," Sarah had said. "But look inside." Rose had opened the box, expecting to find it empty. Instead, she had discovered a collection of small items, a ticket stub from Sarah's high school graduation, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, a hospital bracelet from when Emma was born, and a small piece of paper with Jake's first attempt at writing his name. "He kept pieces of all the important moments," Sarah had said, her voice wondering. Even during the worst of it, Dad was still collecting memories of our family." Henry had died suddenly 2 years earlier, a heart attack that had taken him while he was working in his beloved garden. Rose had found comfort in knowing that his passing had been peaceful, but she had grieved deeply for all the conversations they would never have, all the moments they would never share. "He believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself," Sarah had continued, "just like you did. Even when I was at my worst, you never gave up on me." Rose had pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, both of them crying for all the pain they had endured and all the love that had sustained them through it. In that moment, Rose had understood something fundamental about forgiveness. It wasn't just about letting go of hurt, but about choosing to see the whole person rather than just their mistakes. The months that followed had brought new challenges and new joys. Sarah had been promoted at work, her experience with recovery making her invaluable in helping other families navigate similar struggles. She had started dating again, a gentle relationship with a teacher named Mark, who understood the complexities of blended families and the importance of taking things slowly. Emma had won the school science fair with a project about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to heal and form new pathways. "It's like how Mom got better," she had explained to Rose with the matter-of-fact wisdom of adolescence. "Her brain learned new ways to be happy." Jake had made the all-star baseball team and had started asking thoughtful questions about addiction and recovery. "Why do some people get sick like Mom did?" he had asked one day. Rose had been impressed by Sarah's honest, age-appropriate explanation about how some people's brains respond differently to certain medications, and how getting help when you need it is a sign of strength, not weakness. The family dynamics had settled into a new normal that was healthier than anything they had experienced before Sarah's illness. The crisis had stripped away superficial interactions and forced them to build relationships based on honesty and genuine care. Sunday dinners at Rose's house had become a cherished tradition, with Sarah often arriving early to help cook and stay late to help clean up, simply because she enjoyed the time together. On a quiet evening in late spring, Rose had been working in her small garden when Sarah had arrived unexpectedly. She had been carrying a small potted plant, a rose bush with delicate pink blooms. "I wanted to plant this for you," Sarah had said, "to thank you for everything, for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." They had worked together in the soft evening light, their hands dark with soil as they carefully transplanted the rose bush into Rose's garden. As they worked, Sarah had shared her plans for the future. She was considering going back to school to become a certified addiction counselor, and she was thinking about buying a house with a bigger yard where the children could have more space to play. "I never thought I'd be able to plan for the future again," Sarah had admitted. "For so long, I could barely get through each day. But now I can see possibilities again." Rose had looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and had seen not just the woman she had become, but the child she had been, and the mother she was growing into. Sarah's face had character lines now that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than just age. Her eyes held depth that came from having traveled to dark places and found her way back to the light. As they finished planting the rose bush, Sarah had made one more confession. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about all the things I wish I could tell him. I think he would be proud of who I'm becoming." "He was always proud of you," Rose had assured her. "Even during the hardest times, he would tell me that you were the strongest person he knew, and that you would find your way back to us when you were ready." That night, as Rose had prepared for bed, she had looked out her window at the newly planted rose bush. In the moonlight, it seemed to glow with promise, a symbol of growth and renewal that would bloom for years to come. She had thought about the journey that had brought her family to this place, the pain and the healing, the mistakes and the forgiveness, the despair and the hope. She had learned that love wasn't always enough to save someone, but it was always enough to welcome them home when they were ready to save themselves. She had discovered that strength sometimes looked like admitting weakness, and that healing often required breaking open old wounds to let in light. Most importantly, she had come to understand that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice. The choice to keep believing in the possibility of change, to keep extending grace when it seemed undeserved, and to keep planting flowers in the faith that spring would always follow winter. As Rose had drifted off to sleep that night, she had whispered a prayer of gratitude for the long, difficult journey that had brought them all back together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice love and forgiveness. But tonight, her family was whole, her daughter was healing, and her grandchildren were safe in their beds, dreaming of futures bright with possibility. The rose bush would bloom in its season, just as her family had learned to bloom again after the harsh winter of addiction and estrangement. And Rose would be there to tend it, to water it with her tears and her laughter, to watch it grow strong and beautiful under the endless mercy of each new day.